Hey, in this video, I'll talk about my creative process for stylized characters. Now keep in mind this is not an in-depth tutorial on character creation, it's more of a breakdown mixed with tips and tricks that I feel could help people when creating stylized characters. For this project I was mostly inspired by the art style of Overwatch and Heroes of the Storm. It's a very colorful style. It has nice silhouettes, and overall I think it just looks very good. Silhouettes are super important, especially when you're doing stylized characters. They give information to your viewer about your character's story, their role, maybe even some mechanics they could have. Even with no colors or texture, you can already see how different these two characters are. You're not gonna confuse the one on the left with the one on the right. Comparing both characters, we can see the one on the left is meant to be a speedy character. They have long legs and a skinny frame, while the one on the right looks bulkier and slower, but also stronger. You might not realize it, but when you look at a shape, your brain tends to associate it with attributes or feelings. Now, these are just a few examples, but there's a bunch more, but it can really help when you're designing to know what kind of shape evokes what kind of feeling. So when you look at the female form, some of the features or traits that you'll see are large eyes, soft faces, smaller noses, long legs, narrow shoulders and waist, but very large hips. And if you look at the male form, you'll usually have harsher traits in the face. They'll have a square jaw, a more pronounced brow. They'll have broad shoulders and broad back, narrow waist and narrow hips. Just overall more muscle mass. Now, these traits are not set in stone. There's nothing preventing you from picking more masculine traits and then adding them to a female character. I think a good example of that is Zarya. She still has feminine traits, but then if you look at her jaw, she has a way more pronounced and defined jawline. Bending and twisting these expectations can make for a really interesting character, so don't be scared to experiment. The big thing you want to remember when you do stylized art is to exaggerate your proportions and your features. Apart from exaggerating your proportions, other elements that you'll want to add to your designs. Number one, putting bevels on your hard surface pieces and making sure they're large enough that they can be seen from a distance without being zoomed in. So if we look at this image, for example, right here is a really great example. It helps making a nicer silhouette and it's visible and you don't have to zoom in. If you have to zoom in, either don't put a bevel or really make it larger. Number two, panel lines. This is mostly for sci-fi and more modern designs, but it really makes a nice little detail. We have a good example on this piece right here. It can also be used to make a material transition, so this could be metal and then here's some kind of fabric or a non-metallic material. And then number three is adding trims. We have a couple of examples in this image. For example, right here on the shoulder armor, you have a different transition that are helped by having a trim-like piece in between. And another one is on the pants. It really helps once again to have nice material transition and making it easier to differentiate each pieces from each other, so like the top layer from the underneath layer. You also want to make sure to have areas on your character where the viewer can rest their eyes. You don't want them to always look at something that's incredibly busy. If we look at the pants, you have lines and folds and little details and everything. And then when your eye shifts over here, you have a larger surface that has barely any details, and you have to keep a nice balance between busy areas and areas of rest. Gathering references for your project is a really important step. Now, what I'm showing right here is just a fraction of what I ended up with. You can use whatever software you want to make your reference board. I would personally suggest PureRef. It's a free software and it's really easy to use. Another thing I like to do before sculpting is to create the material breakdown of the project. It really helps to know what kind of materials you're gonna need. There's a bunch of different ways you can start out your sculpt. In this case, I use the base mesh. It's mostly because it saves a lot of time. You already have some forms there, you have decent topology to work from. Even though it's a realistic base mesh, I don't really care, because I'm gonna change it so much that it's not even gonna show. Like I said, I just want a base topology to work from. Splitting your base mesh in different parts really helps when you want to detail your hands or the head, because you can increase the subdivision level for these specific parts and not the whole mesh. So let's say I was done with my blocking. The way I usually like to clean up my shapes is I would mask out the area I want to clean. So let's say this was a nice shoulder pad. I'd mask this part, and then I would go in my subtool menu, extract. Now I make sure to have 0 thickness. This is mostly because it makes it easier to move the shape around after. It's also way more clean and tidy. You don't have too much information in the way. So accept. So now I'd have my shoulder pad. Usually I would also go to geometry and do a Z-remesh to make sure I have a nice topology to work on. It's also really useful later on when you're gonna do your panel loops, and even when you're gonna do the actual retopology for the low poly. Let's say this is a topology I'm fine with. The next step is adding the panel loops for the thickness. There's a bunch of settings. Most of them are not gonna change too much. It always depends on the piece you're making. So loops is how many loops you want in between the top part and the bottom part of the panel loop. Usually I keep it at 1 or 2. Thickness, that's pretty self-explanatory. The only two that I always put at 0 are polish and bevel. I don't really like what they do. They usually just mess up the shape. The elevation is whether you want it to go upwards this way or downward. So let's just take a look. So the really neat thing about panel loop is not only do you have thickness, but you also get polygroups, which are really good for the next step, which is to add creases right here. So what creases do is they allow to keep some sharp edges where you add the creases without adding additional loops. So it's a non-destructive workflow. It's really, really useful. The level needed is dependent on the size of your mesh, so you might have to play with that a bit. Usually for stylized art, 2 or 3 seems to be the best number. You have a different bunch of options. Usually the one I like the best is crease polygroups here. So you see when you click it, it adds a dotted line around all of the polygroups. And if I was to do a dynamic subdiv, you'd see it keeps the shape really sharp compared without. So it's really, really useful when you're making pretty much anything that's armor or even clothes. The way I actually make armor is almost the same thing as clothes, unless I need something more detailed. I might use a software called Marvelous, but otherwise it's pretty much the same way for both type of pieces. So this would be pretty good. When you're satisfied with the amount that the crease does, you could start adding subdivisions. The important thing you want to keep in mind is even if you added creases to keep some sharpness, you want to make sure that it's not too sharp. In this case, it's not too bad, honestly. Like, it looks pretty decent, but let's say instead I use this much. Alright. Like, this is way too sharp. It's not gonna bake very nicely, and it's like, even for realistic stuff, this isn't good. Like, you'd have to go and manually smooth it out. So if possible, I like to make sure that it looks really good just with the sub deactivated and not having a bunch of subdivisions already made and then having to smooth it all. Something I forgot to mention when I was talking about extracts is one way I like to clean up my shapes really quickly is to use polish by features. So let's say I want to keep these two sharp corners, I would mask them out, then go in deformation, polish by features, and as you can see, it helps smoothing out all of the uneven waviness of the form. When I sculpt folds for clothes, there's a few different brushes that I use. Most of the time it's either going to be the standard brush for the main part, followed by damp standard to give it a bit of sharpness, and then smooth it out a bit. But there's also a few brushes that I downloaded or made myself. One of those is this one right here. It's pretty much a damp standard, but with a different alpha. Then there's these two brushes that I downloaded. They're both standard brushes with different attributes. I believe the strength and the gravity are what was modified. So using a combination of all of these, I'll create all of my folds, and sometimes just to help give it that little stylized extra, I might use the H polish with lowered intensity and just a little pass to make it even sharper. And since it's stylized clothing, you usually don't want too many folds and not too many complicated folds either. You want some very specific ones that are gonna help a lot with the silhouette. You don't want to we're not making realistic art, so you don't want to end up with like a bunch of little wrinkles everywhere. You'll usually want folds where there's compression, like points of compression, your elbows, your knees, and sometimes maybe your shoulders, like places where there's a lot of movement and where cloth will usually fold. One tool that I really like in ZBrush is Morph Target. I mainly use it when I want to try some changes that I'm not sure I want to keep. So for example, let's say I wanted to play with the faces, like move the cheekbone around. It would be really annoying to move everything around and then I'm like, I want to see what it looked like before and always have to do Ctrl Z. So one thing you can do is go in Morph Target, click Store Morph Target. So what that's going to do is, let's say I did move some stuff around and I wanted to see what it looked like before. I just have to go here, press switch, and I can see the difference between the two meshes. There's a few things you have to keep in mind. One is that the subdivision you created your morph target at is important, because if I go higher or lower, I can't use the switch button anymore, so that's something you have to keep in mind. And another thing that's really neat is, let's say I like some of the changes, but I want to soften them a bit. You can go B, M, O for the morph target brush, and then you can just paint away some of the changes you did, which is pretty neat. Of course, that's not gonna work, like I said, if you go higher or lower. And when you're ready to accept the changes, you can simply delete the morph target. Recently, I've gotten into the habit of slightly opening my character's mouth when I'm done sculpting them. I mainly do this because it makes it way easier when I'm retopologizing the interior of the mouth and when I'm going to do the bakes, because otherwise you get some weird lines and artifacts where the lips meet. When it comes down to retopology, I don't really do anything too fancy. I do mine in Maya because I really like their retopology tool. I'll usually just bring a decimated version of the high poly for the piece that I'm working on and just go from there. Sometimes if the piece had a good topology at its lowest subdivision, I might use that as a base to save some time. This is mostly the case for armor pieces. For the facial topology, I usually follow the guidelines that are on the screen right now. Mainly the placement of the 5 poles. It's the points where 5 edges meet, as well as the placement of the loops that allow for good deformation when you animate or do facial expressions with your character. For this character specifically, I also use the guidelines that Blizzard had for Overwatch, mainly the triangle count and the texture sizes. My setup for eyes isn't too complicated, nothing too fancy. For the base, I use a sphere that I shape into an actual eyeball, and then I'll add a cap over it, which will act as the cornea. It will have a transparent shader. You could technically just have one whole sphere and just paint everything, including the little specular. For this project, I decided to do it this way. It's honestly up to you. There's a bunch of different ways to do eyes, so that's just the way I've done mine. The other thing I added is a plane that will have a gradient texture along with a gradient alpha. So this will give a little bit of shadow over the eyeball. It really helps sell the look, and if you didn't do it with a plane, you could paint it, but it's going to look really awkward because when you'll move the eyeball around, you're gonna see the shadow move with it. So I think this is a pretty good solution. And for lashes, it's pretty much just a plane that I shape and then just put a texture on it. When making the UVs for your eyes, I suggest you select the middle part of the eye, the iris, and make it bigger than the middle part here. It doesn't really matter in stylized art that this part here is a little bit blurry, because you'll usually not have that many details. You're not gonna have the veins and everything. All of the attention, all of the focus of your viewer is going to be right here in the middle where the iris is. So it's better to have way more definition here. And that's actually something that you can apply to the whole body for your character. You can you can select the face and make it a bit bigger, because it's kind of the same principle. Your viewer's eye is mostly going to be drawn toward the face, so giving it a bit more resolution can help. Don't go too overboard, of course. You don't want to have like quadruple the size of UVs for the head, but just enough so that when you actually create your texture, you'll have enough space to work and add details where you want. when you're done doing the topology for your character, you'll want to assign texture sets. So the amount of texture sets you have for your character is up to you. Some people will have one for the head, one for upper body, one for lower body, and then one for accessories, one for the eyes. For this project, I went with one for the whole body, one for the eyes, one for the cornea, and one for the transitional mesh, as well as one for the sword. I decided to not have one just for the face because I wasn't going to have very small micro details, so I didn't need one whole set just for that. Everything fit nicely on one sheet. So the way you do that is you simply assign a different material for each texture set you want. So for example, I have mine here, and this is going to help when you're going to bring your model in Substance to texture it, because there's a function in Substance where you can just isolate each texture set, so it makes it way easier to work on a specific piece. And it's also going to be used when you're going to bake your maps. I bake most of my maps in Marmoset Toolbag. I just really like the tool. I like that you have the option to actually edit in real time some of the bakes. Let's say there's like a projection error, you can just go and paint it out and correct it in real time, so that's really neat. So the way my bakes are set up is nothing special. I use the match by mesh name, which means that all of my low poly parts have underscore low at the end, and all of my high poly parts have underscore high at the end. Also, I make sure to have enough padding, because you don't want to end up with a texture that pretty much ends like flush right next to the UV border, because otherwise you're gonna have problems when looking at your model from afar. You're gonna get like really nasty seams. Also, one thing I like to do is to bake in 4K no matter the resolution size that I'll use in the end. So for example, for this project I had 2K, but I still baked in 4K because it's way easier to downgrade your texture size than try to upscale it from a lower one. And it also gives nicer results to bake 4K, go to 2K, than just bake from 2K. So these are the maps that I used. They're pretty standard. I would say material ID is not checked because it's actually one of the rare maps that I bake in Substance. So this map is used to easily apply materials without painting masks. What I mean is, for example, if you look at this shoulder pad, this trim here, let's say I wanted it to be gold and I wanted the bolt here to be silver. Well, with a color ID map, you don't have to manually go and paint this little bolt here in Substance Painter. You can just assign it a color, and then in Substance Painter create a mask from this color, so you could really quickly have all of the little bolts be silver and all of the trims be gold, and you can really quickly change all of the materials and make changes this way. So it's a really useful tool that I think it's worth setting up. Okay, this is how I do my color ID setup. I do it in ZBrush. You could probably do it in Photoshop. I just think it's faster and easier for me in ZBrush. So let's say I wanted to do the color ID for this ornament here. So first I would activate the polypaint here. So as you can see, there's already a color here. That's the one I used for my project, but let's say I wanted to make it a very bright green. I would select the color here, then go to color, fill object, and make sure you have a RGB on, fill object, and then voila. So I would do this for all of the subtools, and I tried to do it in a somewhat orderly manner. So I would do all of the trims, all of the leather, like everything that I know is going to most likely have the same material. And something that I try to keep in mind is, even though I'm not at the texture stage yet, I try to keep a nice material variation on my pieces. What I mean is, let's take this shoulder pad for example. So instead of just having like one metal material for the whole shoulder pad, I'd have one for the cross and a different one for the metal piece here, and then in this case I actually used the same one on the trim and on the ornaments, but then I could also have another one on the bolt, just to make sure that you don't have twice the same material next to one another. It keeps the model interesting to look at, and it helps make flat surfaces like the breastplate, the shoulder pad look a little bit more interesting than if you had like same material here, here, and here. But I'm going to go into more details when I'm actually in Substance Painter anyway. So once you're done putting all of the colors, what I'll do is go to Z plugin, FBX, export import, and I would export it as an FBX.